Imagine you are a German Fallschirmjäger, a paratrooper. You are not just a soldier, you are the elite, the best of the best. You are a veteran of the brutal fighting in Crete, in Italy, at Monte Cassino. You have been tempered in the hottest fires of the war. Fear is a luxury you cannot afford. And here in the autumn of 1944, you are the master of your own personal kingdom of hell. It is a dark, tangled, and dying forest on the border of your homeland, a place the terrified Americans have nicknamed the Green Hell, the Hürtgen Forest. And within this kingdom, you stand upon its throne. It is a steep, muddy, 400-meter-high lump of earth, but it is the most important piece of ground for 50 miles in any direction. From its summit, you can see everything. You control the roads, the valleys, the very destiny of this battle. Your commanders call it Hill 400. You and your comrades call it the Bergberg, the Castle Hill, because that is what it is, a fortress. For weeks you have watched the Americans throw themselves against your positions. Wave after wave of their green, inexperienced infantry have tried to climb your hill, and you have slaughtered them. You have watched them break and run, leaving their dead scattered on the muddy slopes. You hold them in contempt. They are clumsy, they are loud, they are not warriors. They are factory boys sent to die at the hands of professionals. You and your brothers in arms, the hardened veterans of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, know with an absolute certainty that this hill will never fall. And then, one cold December morning, something changes. The attack that comes is different. It is fast. It is silent. It is unnaturally aggressive. It is not the clumsy GIs you have been killing for weeks. This is something else. This is the American Rangers. And before you can even comprehend what is happening, they are on top of you, a whirlwind of knives and grenades. But even this is not what breaks you. The true horror comes later. It comes when you have regrouped, when you have massed your forces for the inevitable, overwhelming counterattack to reclaim your hill. As you prepare to charge, you hear a new sound. It is not the familiar whistle of a few incoming shells. It is a whisper from the sky itself, a sound like the fabric of the universe tearing apart. In a single, soul-shattering instant, the sky falls. Not one shell, not 10, but hundreds of shells from every direction slam into your position at the exact same moment. The forest, the earth, your comrades, they don't just explode, they vaporize. It is not a barrage, it is an act of annihilation, delivered with a precision that feels like the judgment of a cruel and angry God. You, the elite paratrooper, the master of the battlefield, are now just a terrified boy curled in the mud as the unconquerable hill you were sworn to defend is turned into your tomb. You have just learned the terrible truth that the Americans had been trying to teach you for weeks. You can fight their soldiers, you can even beat them, but you cannot fight their artillery. This is the story of that hill, and the story of the day the sky fell down. To understand the sheer bloody-mindedness of the battle for Hill 400, you must first understand the Hürtgen Forest. It was not a forest in the idyllic sense. It was a dark, primordial entity. 100 square miles of densely packed pine trees, so thick that in many places they blotted out the sky, creating a perpetual gloomy twilight even at midday. The ground was a tangled web of steep, rocky ravines, thick undergrowth, and sucking ankle-deep mud that seemed to pull the strength from a man's very soul. The weather in the winter of 1944 was a constant, miserable drizzle that turned to sleet and snow, chilling a man to the bone. And the trees themselves were a weapon. Artillery shells, instead of burying themselves in the soft earth, would often detonate in the high branches, creating a terrifying phenomenon the GIs called a tree burst. This would send a deadly shower of hot steel shrapnel and wooden splinters raining down, a storm that could kill a man in his foxhole, a death that came from above, unseen and inescapable. The American High Command had a strategic reason for entering this hellscape. They needed to capture the series of dams on the Roar River, to prevent the Germans from flooding the plains to the north and stalling the Allied advance into Germany. But for the common soldier, it was a battle without logic, a meat grinder that chewed up men and swallowed entire divisions. The fighting was claustrophobic, brutal, and personal. It was a war of machine gun nests hidden in log bunkers, of surprise attacks from unseen enemies, of getting lost just a few hundred yards from your own lines. American morale in the Hürtgen was at an all-time low. The forest was winning. And at the very heart of the German defensive network in this forest stood Hill 400. On a map, it was just a number. On the ground, it was a fortress. It was the highest point in the entire sector. Its bare, treeless summit offered perfect, unobstructed observation for miles. Whoever controlled Hill 400 controlled the entire region. The Germans knew this. They had turned it into a masterpiece of defensive engineering. The slopes were laced with machine gun pits, elaborate trench systems, and camouflage mortar positions. The approaches were pre-sighted, meaning every inch of the ground was a pre-plotted kill zone for their machine guns and mortars. And who did the German High Command entrust with the defense of this vital position, this queen of the forest? Not regular infantry, they sent their best, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. These were not the young conscripts or old men who were now filling the ranks of the depleted Wehrmacht. These were the elite of the German military. They were veteran paratroopers, the hardened survivors of the airborne invasions of the early war and the brutal defensive battles in Italy. They were masters of defensive warfare, experts in camouflage and infiltration. They were proud, they were arrogant, and they had every right to be. They looked down on the American GIs as inferior soldiers, and for weeks the results on the battlefield had proven them right. The American 28th Infantry Division had bled itself white trying to take the Hürtgen, earning the grim nickname, the Bloody Bucket. The Germans on Hill 400 felt invincible. They were the kings of their castle, and they were ready to slaughter anyone who dared to challenge them. By early December, the American command was desperate. The frontal assaults by regular infantry divisions had failed at a horrific cost. The Hürtgen had become a symbol of American failure, a bloody stalemate that was consuming men and morale at an alarming rate. They needed a new approach. They needed a scalpel to succeed where the sledgehammer had failed. They needed their own elite. They needed the Rangers. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was a unique unit in the American Army. They were the spiritual descendants of Rogers Rangers from the colonial wars, men who were trained to be light, fast, and lethal. Their motto was simple and direct: Rangers, lead the way. And they had been leading the way since the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc on D-Day. They were the Army's troubleshooters, the elite light infantry force that was thrown into the toughest, most impossible situations. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, a tough, no-nonsense Texan who had personally led the legendary assault on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. He understood that his men were not a conventional force. They were not meant to hold lines. They were meant to break them. Their training was relentless, focusing on physical endurance, infiltration, and aggressive, violent action. A Ranger was expected to be able to march farther, climb higher, and fight harder than any other soldier. But even for the Rangers, the Hürtgen Forest was a shock, and the mission they were given seemed suicidal. 2 of the battalion's 6 companies, D and F companies, a force of barely 130 men, were ordered to do what an entire infantry regiment had failed to do. They were ordered to assault Hill 400 directly, not to flank it, not to lay siege to it. They were to run straight up the steepest, most heavily defended slope and take the summit by sheer force of will. The plan was born of desperation, but it had a cold, brutal logic. A long, drawn-out fight would allow the Germans to use their superior numbers and defensive positions to grind the attackers down. The only chance of success was speed, a lightning-fast, brutally violent assault that would overwhelm the defenders before they could react. It was a classic Ranger mission. It was also, very likely, a one-way ticket. The men who would lead this charge were veterans, but they were not supermen. They were exhausted from months of continuous combat. Captain George Williams, commanding F Company, and Captain Mort Slater, commanding D Company, looked at the muddy, steep 400-meter slope they were supposed to climb and knew that many of their men would not be coming back. Among them were sergeants like Leonard Lommel, a quiet, respected leader who had already earned a Silver Star for bravery in Normandy. They were the best the Army had, and they were about to be thrown against the best the German Army had. The stage was set for a clash of Titans on a muddy hill in a dying forest. The morning of December 7th, 1944, broke cold and wet. The Rangers of D and F companies moved silently to their line of departure at the base of Hill 400. There was no massive preparatory artillery barrage to announce their attack. That was part of the plan. The key was surprise. At 7:30 a.m., the signal was given, and the Rangers exploded from the woodline. This was not a cautious advance from cover to cover. This was a sprint. A mad, desperate, all-out charge straight up a 45-degree slope of muddy mud and tangled roots. They ran directly into the teeth of the German defenses. The German Fallschirmjäger, masters of their craft, were ready. Their machine guns, The terrifying MG-42s, the Hitler's Bawsaw, opened up, their incredible rate of fire tearing the air apart. Mortar shells began to rain down, the explosions walking up and down the slope, turning the muddy ground into a geyser of shrapnel and dirt. The Rangers began to fall. Men were cut down in mid-stride, their bodies tumbling back down the hill. But they did not stop. They did not slow down. They bent low, their faces contorted with effort, and they kept climbing, kept running, firing their rifles from the hip. The sheer, insane ferocity of their charge was something the German defenders had never seen before. At the very tip of this human spearhead were two men from D Company, First Sergeant Leonard Lomel and Staff Sergeant Jack Petty. They spotted the source of the most devastating fire, a heavily fortified German machine gun nest that was enfilading the entire slope, cutting their company to pieces. They didn't wait for orders. Acting on pure instinct, they broke off from the main charge and executed a flanking maneuver. While one lay down covering fire, the other would crawl forward. They leapfrogged their way through the storm of bullets until they were within grenade range. With two perfectly thrown grenades, they silenced the nest. The spine of the German defense was broken. Their action created a breach. The rest of the Rangers poured through it. They reached the crest of the hill in a state of primal fury. The fighting devolved into a brutal, medieval brawl. It was a battle of bayonets, trench knives, and entrenching tools. Rangers and Fallschirmjäger, two of the world's most elite fighting forces, tore at each other in the mud and the craters of the summit. The German paratroopers were stunned. They had been masters of this hill for weeks. They had contempt for the Americans, and now, in a matter of minutes, their fortress had been breached by a handful of screaming, mud-caked devils. Their command structure collapsed. They broke. Most were killed. A few fled down the reverse slope of the hill. From the moment the first Ranger broke from the tree line to the moment the last German was cleared from the summit, the battle for the top of Hill 400 had lasted less than 30 minutes. The impossible had been achieved. The Rangers had taken the Queen of the Forest. But now came the hard part: holding it. For the German command in the Hürtgen sector, the loss of Hill 400 was not just a tactical setback, it was an unthinkable humiliation. The pride of the Wehrmacht, their elite Fallschirmjäger, had been thrown off their fortress by a small American raiding party. It was an insult that could not be tolerated. The order was given immediately: retake the hill at any cost. Throughout the day, the Germans gathered their forces. They knew the Rangers on the summit were isolated, their numbers drastically reduced by the assault. It was a race against time. The Germans began to pound the hilltop with a ferocious artillery and mortar barrage. The very ground the Rangers had just captured was now being turned into a slaughterhouse. But this was just the prelude. The Germans were massing their infantry for a full-scale counterattack. The Rangers huddled in the shallow German foxholes they had just captured could hear the sounds of the enemy gathering in the woods below. They were low on ammunition, their radios were struggling to get a clear signal, and their numbers were dwindling with every incoming shell. By late afternoon, of roughly 130 Rangers who had started the assault, only a few dozen were still capable of fighting. They were alone, they were surrounded, and they were about to be annihilated. It was in this moment of supreme desperation that the other half of the American plan was finally unleashed. All day, the artillery forward observers attached to the Rangers had been calling in coordinates, registering targets, and feeding a constant stream of information back to the fire direction centers miles away. The Rangers on the hill had done their job. They had acted as the bait. Now, the trap was about to be sprung. As the first wave of the German counterattack, a force of several hundred veteran paratroopers broke from the cover of the trees to retake the slope, their officers gave the signal to charge. And in that exact moment, the American Artillery Command gave its own signal. What happened next is difficult to describe in conventional military terms. It was not a barrage. It was an event. From every corner of the American sector, from dozens of different artillery batteries, 10 5mm howitzers, 155mm long toms, heavy 4.2-inch mortars, the shells had been fired, all timed with a cold, mathematical precision. For the charging German paratroopers, the first sign of doom was a sound, a horrifying, unnatural roar from the sky, the sound of 1,000 freight trains converging on their exact location. Before they had time to even comprehend the sound, the sky tore open. Hundreds of high-explosive shells, all arriving in the exact same second, slammed into the German assault wave. The forest vaporized, the ground heaved and buckled. Men were not just killed, they were erased from existence. The concussive blast alone was so powerful it was a weapon in itself. The carefully organized German counterattack ceased to exist in a single, apocalyptic instant. The Rangers on the hilltop could only stare in stunned, horrified awe. They were so close to the impact zone that the ground shook beneath them and hot shrapnel rained down around their positions. One Ranger would later say, "The whole world just went up in one great big explosion. We saw bodies and equipment flying through the air." The Germans were professionals. They were brave. But this was beyond comprehension. The first wave was annihilated. They tried to organize a second wave. The artillery hit them again. And again. The American FDCs fed a constant stream of information from the observers on the hill, were orchestrating a symphony of destruction. They were placing a wall of impenetrable steel around the surviving Rangers. The German paratroopers, men who had faced the worst the war could throw at them, finally broke. They were not defeated by the Rangers they could see. They were defeated by an invisible,
all-powerful enemy they couldn't fight. They were defeated by a storm of steel that seemed to be controlled by the mind of God Himself.
The great artillery barrage had shattered the main German counterattack, but the battle for Hill 400 was far from over. The night of December 7th and the entire following day, December 8th, devolved into a desperate, grinding struggle for survival for the handful of Rangers left on the summit. Of the 2 companies that had started the assault, only 25 men remained who were still able to fight. They were commanded by a young 20-year-old Lieutenant George Kirchner, whose superiors had all been killed or wounded. They were completely isolated, a tiny island of American resistance in a sea of German fury. The Germans, though their main assault had been broken, did not give up. They continued to probe the Rangers' defenses with smaller patrol actions. Snipers took up positions in the surrounding trees. Their own artillery and mortars pounded the hilltop relentlessly, turning the summit into a cratered, corpse-strewn moonscape. The conditions for the surviving Rangers were beyond miserable. It was freezing cold. They were exhausted, having been fighting for over 36 hours without sleep. They were critically low on ammunition and medical supplies. Their water had frozen in their canteens. To survive, they had to crawl from foxhole to foxhole, scavenging ammunition and weapons from their fallen comrades and from the German dead. It was a battle of sheer grit. The Rangers held on through the long, terrifying night, fighting off shadows and sounds, never knowing when the next attack would come. They held on through the next day, their bodies numb with cold and exhaustion, their minds struggling to stay alert. They refused to give up the ground they had bought with the blood of their brothers. They knew that if they failed, the sacrifice of every man who had fallen on the slope would be for nothing. Finally, on the afternoon of December 8th, the relief force arrived. A battalion from the regular infantry, supported by tanks, fought its way up the hill and secured the position. When they reached the summit, they were shocked by what they found. The ground was a churned-up wasteland of craters and shattered trees, and holding the entire position was a small, ragged band of just over a dozen exhausted, frostbitten, but utterly unbroken Rangers. They had held hell. The battle for Hill 400 was over. The cost had been staggering. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had suffered over 80% casualties. They had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. They were pulled off the line, their ranks decimated, their mission accomplished. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The capture of Hill 400 was a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. It had broken the back of the German defensive line, allowing the American forces to finally push forward and capture the vital Roar River dams. The story of Hill 400 is a story of contrasts. It is the story of the incredible, almost suicidal bravery of the Rangers, who took an unconquerable position with sheer audacious courage. But it is also the story of the cold, anonymous, and terrifyingly efficient power of American artillery. It was a battle that demonstrated the perfect, brutal synergy between the scalpel and the sledgehammer. For the German Fallschirmjäger, it was a lesson they would never forget. They, the masters of defensive warfare, had been outfought by American light infantry and then annihilated by a weapon they had fatally underestimated. The psychological blow was as devastating as the physical one. The myth of their invincibility, which had sustained them through years of hard fighting, was shattered in the mud of a single, insignificant hill. Today, Hill 400, the Bergberg, is quiet. The forest has grown back. The craters have softened. But the echo of that desperate battle remains. It is the echo of the Rangers' war cry, "Lead the way." And it is the echo of that other, more terrible sound. The sound of 1,000 shells arriving at the instant. The sound of the sky falling down. It is a testament to a moment in time when a handful of very brave men, backed by an unseen, all-powerful force, accomplished the impossible. They had climbed their hill.